Remember when Fauci said this?
Once people feel empowered and protected legally, you were going to have schools, universities, and colleges are going to say, you want to come to this college, buddy? You're going to get vaccinated. It's been proven that when you make it difficult for people in their lives, they lose their ideological bull and they get vaccinated.
Oh boy. Yeah. Who's the ideological one? That's the big question. Well, with us tonight is Dr. Michael Schwartz. He owns and operates 3 medical clinics in both New Jersey and Florida. Now, he's important because his company was the first in New Jersey to start conducting COVID-19 testing. So from that point on, they had thousands of patients and were able to collect more data on the COVID-19 pandemic than almost anyone else in the industry. And he's now put it together in a book called Fauci's Fiction, the book on COVID, how the government and modern medicine missed the boat on COVID-19 from day one. Mike, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
Can you believe that with Fauci? I mean, just they saying, oh, people will drop their ideological bullshit if we just force them into the vaccine. And yet it was really Fauci and his team and many who were the ideological ones not following the science.
You're not kidding. And they made it really difficult for a lot of people. And now those people are having a lot of difficulties after those shots. And still, with the suicide rate going up and kids out of school, the learning curve, I mean, you name it, the exercise we went through was very needless. And it's quite alarming.
Yeah. So let's talk about, so you were the first, your clinic was the first to begin testing in New Jersey. And so you were able to collect a lot of data. You were getting a lot of the data early on. What were you hearing versus what you were seeing and experiencing from the data you were collecting versus like the narrative that was going on?
Well, it didn't match. I mean, you got to understand we did this in cycles, right? So it was, the first grouping of patients in the first week or two, we're out testing folks and we're nervous ourselves. We don't know what we're dealing with. So we're outside on porches, testing people with PPE on. But, the first couple of weeks of testing, you're testing people from all age ranges. And, the first elderly couple you do, you're kind of nervous because you see what's going on in Italy at that point and in Europe, and you figure, oh my, this could be the big one. So, you're following up on those patients, realizing they're all recovering. And you got to keep this in mind. I had 19,000 patients in total. We did 44,000 plus tests. I had over 4,000 positives. And out of that grouping, if you put the science in perspective, we only had, it was 85 to 90% asymptomatic. Only 10 to 15% had any classical symptoms. So you're calling those patients, you're watching them recover, and then you're relaying that to the next set of patients and so on and so on. So you're learning this in real time, but the data wasn't matching what we were seeing on TV. And we just kept kind of shaking our heads. And the media was always about 12 months behind at all times.
Which is outrageous. You'd think that with the way we have information, we have social media, we have internet, we can get information almost in real time, and yet it takes 12 months for people to catch up to the narrative. I want to break down this data a little bit more. So you're saying you did 44,000 tests and you had 19,000 patients. So does that mean the people took the test more than once? Were they coming back to you?
Yeah. And you got to keep it in perspective. So you remember sick people go to the hospital, they go to the doctor's office. We have an office, but we're also doing school districts, police departments. We're doing assisted living. So we have what's called horizontal data. A lot of the police officers that we did, for instance, we had a test for 3 years straight. You'd go to a police department every single Wednesday, and I'd have to call 10 officers every Thursday to tell them that they were positive, but I'd have to convince 9 of them they were because they didn't have any symptoms. And there's a lot to understand and break down and, get into, because COVID isn't just negative or positive. It's negative or positive with caveats.
Okay. So you had 19,000 people, 44,000 tests, 4,000 of the tests came back positive. And you said, what percentage of them were asymptomatic?
85 to 90% were asymptomatic.
Okay. So they had no idea that they had COVID. They were shocked.
Correct. And it depends on how you could say 85 to 90% are asymptomatic or mild. Depends on how you define mild. If you define mild as not needing hospitalization, well, I only had 4 out of those 4,000 actually go to the hospital. And we didn't lose one patient during that entire time.
Did you find any patterns for those who were asymptomatic? Were they often younger, or was it just, it could have been anybody? It didn't matter.
So when you understand how we treat it, kind of makes sense. Before, I always say my patients knew what COVID swabs were long before anyone else did, because if you had come to our office 5 years ago, we were going to swab you. We use something in our office called a respiratory pathogen panel, and this becomes very, very important. Most of the folks that were coming back sick from COVID had a co-infection, and usually it was Staph aureus. And to put it, give you a little bit more perspective, I had a guy about 2 years ago who I write in the book. He had COVID, Staph, H flu, and RSV all at the same time. You would not know that by doing a rapid test, a home test, or a COVID only test on a PCR. You have to look at the panel and see what's going on in somebody's system. So properly diagnosing this was the first step. So we noticed that if we were calling a patient and they were symptomatic, most of the time we were calling them, telling them they had COVID and something else on top of it. A lot of the COVID onlys didn't have symptoms, although COVID is very real. And people who did get COVID, where it manifested and it multiplied, it replicated in their system to destroy that mitochondria, that's when they started to develop classical symptoms.
And what were the most common symptoms for people that just had COVID?
It's funny because I have this conversation with patients all the time who tell me they think they never had it, and I'll tell them, well, that the norm is not to have a symptom. The most common symptom of COVID is a headache. It has to do with hemoglobin uptake issues. After that, it would be fatigue. So you're not going to automatically develop the cough, the fever, the shortness of breath that everybody thinks that they're going to develop.
Yeah, most of us think of it kind of like a cold, like you end up with the sniffles and unable to breathe or coughing and fever, and that's not the most obvious symptom, or that's not the most common symptom, I should say.
Well, you're getting a reaction mostly from the spike protein, especially after you've had COVID. See, COVID is made up, the envelope has about 27 different proteins inside it. When you get COVID naturally, you're building what's called, you get an antibody response, but then you're building what's called B and T lymphocytes. Your B cells, your memory cells, your T cells, your helper cells. The next time you get COVID, you're responding to the mutation in the spike protein, which could cause, again, cold-like symptoms. But again, you might get it and never know you had it. If you have such a low viral load, and once you understand how testing is done, it makes more sense. Such a low viral load is not going to break down the mitochondria. We're going to get those classical symptoms.
Okay.
It begged the question, Kim, not to cut you off. What I actually said to my immunologist in the middle of this, because we were doing such mass testing in this country, I wonder how many asymptomatic flus exist every year.
Yeah. I started wondering that too during this, because we started talking about asymptomatic COVID, and this started becoming more, I think a lot of us started to wake up a little bit more to vaccines and viruses and asymptomatic and all of these things that we never really thought of before. We just figured, okay, you get sick, you get the flu every year, and it's just kind of normal part of life. But then suddenly the pandemic made us actually stop and think about the things we were being told and the things we had experienced in our lives. And it did make it made me wonder for sure, oh, had I walked around with flu, because I rarely get the flu, maybe I walk around with it asymptomatic and I start spreading it to everybody. But we don't freak out about that, right? And that's the difference between the pandemic and the flu, is we were freaking out about asymptomatic carriers.
Yeah, you shouldn't be, because I mean, the one thing that WHO got right, which they got a lot wrong, but the one thing they got right was, if you look at the early reports, asymptomatic spread is virtually zero. So unless you're coughing, sneezing, exhibiting, you're not going to be spreading it, unless, of course, you live in the same household. We would find that, and that's a good piece of data too, at 100% of the time in our first grouping, which included 441 homes, 100% of the time, if somebody had it in the household who was symptomatic, everybody in the household had it. But those numbers were the same, 90% asymptomatic, 10% symptomatic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a lot of family members who the whole family tested. My sister and her family, they all tested positive, but only one of them maybe actually had symptoms. And so the others were surprised that they actually were carrying COVID as well. So you were collecting all this data. You were seeing that. I mean, what were you thinking of it as you were in real time early on collecting this data? Were you thinking this is kind of like the flu, or this is like a cold, and they're making it sound like it's the plague? I mean, what were you thinking at that time?
Not necessarily, because there's people, when you called them and told them they were positive, they might not have had a symptom at that point, but I would warn them and say, look, there's people that call me and tell me the next day they felt like they got hit by a truck, and that happened a lot. But not as often as you think. The recovery time, though, usually once the fever broke, it was 2 days later, they were kind of back on their feet. And we used a very simple regimen. So the thought process, it evolved very, very rapidly as we went on, because I'm hearing stories of doom and gloom from the hospital in the beginning. Meanwhile, again, I'm testing assisted livings, nursing homes, police departments, and I'm telling a very different story. I'm letting these people at the hospital know, hey, look, I'm testing everybody, and everybody seems to have this, but not everybody is as sick as you say they are in the hospital. And I don't don't know those folks in the hospital, whether they had a co-infection, whether they were testing for co-infections, whether they were looking at a comorbidity or viral load. Putting viral load into perspective makes a world of difference to the listener just trying to figure out how testing works. Because still to this day, we're almost 4 years in, people don't understand the language of a virus, what a virus is, how testing works. And it's, that's the basics that we should have gotten out to the public right off the bat.
Before we get into some of that, did you try at that in the early time of the pandemic when you were like, okay, they're saying this doom and gloom and everybody's going to die? I mean, people were really believing. I think the stat was like 30% of people believed if they caught COVID, they would die, that there was a chance they would die from COVID. I mean, there was a lot of fear around this. So you're watching this, you're seeing something else. Did you try speaking up? And if you did, what was the reaction?
I did initially on social media, and I got ridiculed right away. I said we should probably adopt a Swedish model without going through this. We're gonna hurt more people than than we. But I got ridiculed right away, and then of course I just kind of backed off and said, "Look, I got patients to deal with. We were seeing 100 people a day. Sometimes we were going on multiple sites doing 400 tests a day. So it was quite." It was daunting for me to have to then try to, go out into the media. But that first reaction that I got said, all right, let me just zip it, do my job and collect the data so that we can put this in perspective.
Okay. So you just felt like, okay, just keep your head down, hunker down, collect data, do your job. And I think a lot of people did that. A lot of people felt like, I don't want to get into the mix of it. I mean, there were some of us like myself who were just like out there saying it like, okay, fine, call me all the names that you want to call me. But of course I have a very different job than you do. But yeah, the Swedish model seemed to be the right path now. And even at that time, the epidemiologist there said, okay, give us 3 years and we'll know probably in about 3 years. And he was very patient and said, that's how long it's going to take. Sure enough, 3 years later, people are pointing at Sweden and saying, yeah, okay, it turns out Sweden was right. They didn't have nearly the negative outcome that we had as far as all of the side effects of locking down and keeping people, the depression, the education issues, the lack of diagnoses for just early diseases, other diseases. I mean, we've got a whole host of issues now from the pandemic, from our response.
The vaccine, well, you're right. And there's multiple layers to that. You're absolutely right. I mean, the vaccine has caused so many issues, but again, kids being out of school, suicide rates, learning curves, and you go on and on and on from this exercise and what we did. And of course, Sweden had the exact same curve that we did, the exact same curve. But, folks in the media, folks in the government would like to point to graphs and say, look, the mask worked here. The mask didn't do anything. The mask actually made it worse for a lot of people. And I was, for the record, vocal. It was just, no one would really listen at the time. I had a lot of people look at me and say, why are you the only one saying this? And I would try to tell them there are other doctors, but no one's listening.
Yeah. So let's get to the tests. A lot of people are wondering if tests are even accurate. Do they even detect COVID at all? A lot of us have stocked up on tests. I've got probably a few in the bathroom just in case. So how accurate are these?
We could throw the rapid tests out. It's a little sciencey. I know we've talked about this privately before, but PCR testing is logarithmic, the sensitivity. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not linear. The logarithmic testing goes sensitivity level 1, then 10 times that, 100 times that, 1,000 times that, and so on and so on and so on. So looking for COVID at level 1 is kind of like looking for COVID on my cell phone. This is PCR testing, of course. Looking for COVID at level 36, which is the highest my lab goes to, is looking for COVID in the solar system. Now, if you kept going at multiple levels beyond that, you can find anything in the universe and amplify it. So the lab values the labs that I work with are very reputable. The values that they stop at is 36. And at that level, I only need 9 copies of a virus to tell me it's in your system and bound. Yes, the tests work well. And I know that because it's repeatable data. And I've done this before. If I have a police officer come in who got tested positive, has no symptoms, I can look at his CT value and find out, well, you're so high up on the value level that your viral load is so low, you're not going to have a symptom. I can then repeat that tomorrow with 99 other applicants, find out they're all negative. He's still the one that's going to come back positive. So PCR testing does work very well. But in contrast, those rapid tests you have, it takes 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 9th power of virus. What does that all mean? Instead of those 9 copies, I need 9 million to 9 billion on a rapid to turn that card blue. So if it does, you have enough virus to tell me you definitely have something and you're positive for something. But that's the caveat, because you can turn positive on a rapid test for any coronavirus, including the common cold. There are 7 we test for in the office. So scientifically, it tells me 0, but a negative tells me even less, because you need so much virus to pop that positive on a rapid.
There were some kids that were able to get positives on their tests. They were able to do, they were, of course, trying to skip school, right? So they were able to figure out how to make the rapid test positive. Is that possible? That I think that the rumor was they were using something like orange juice or something, and they were able to turn a rapid positive. Is that? I've heard that they're like what you sounds like what you're saying is that they're more often inaccurate if they're negative. Is that right? Like negative, it means nothing really. Like you could be positive, but it says negative. But
Correct.
if it's positive, it could be a lot of things. But could it be positive and it be nothing, like orange juice?
Yeah, if they're not putting the appropriate amount of fluid in it, they're not doing it the correct way, they're adulterating it somehow. Yes, it can
Okay.
pop. Just take the rapids and throw them out. They tell when someone walks in my office and tells me they had COVID last month, and I ask them how, and they tell me rapid test, I laugh and I try. I mean, it's comical at this point because the information's out there, and we take testing very seriously. But that mass amount of testing is how we got derived all this data. So you might as well just throw those out.